C'est la conférence, donc bienvenue ce soir à la conférence de Martino Stierli. C'est un très grand plaisir, Martino, de t'accueillir ici à l'EPFL. Martino est l'auteur, le curateur de l'exposition Las Vegas Studio, comme vous le savez, avec Hilar Stadler, le directeur du Museum in Bellpark à Kriens. Et ils ont monté ce projet en collaboration avec l'artiste Peter Fischli. C'est une exposition qui a déjà 3 ans bientôt, et ça fait 2 ans qu'on l'attend ici. Elle a beaucoup voyagé aux États-Unis, donc c'était déjà une success story. Et il y a même un projet d'une réédition au musée à Bellpark, on verra. Actuellement, Martino est Oberassistant à la chaire d'histoire de l'art et de l'architecture du professeur Ursprung au Goethe Institut. Il a étudié l'histoire de l'art et de l'architecture à l'université de Zurich et il a fait son master d'histoire de l'art sous la direction du professeur Stanislaus von Moos. Alors, je ne sais pas si c'est l'influence de von Moos ou si Martino a choisi ce professeur à dessein, mais en tous les cas, son intérêt et sa connaissance de l'œuvre de Venturi remontent à de nombreuses années, sont très précoces et suivis, puisqu'on le retrouve déjà dans sa thèse de master à l'UNI, qui s'intitule « Rome in Mind, Robert Venturi, Rome and Postmodernism ». En toute logique, donc après son master en poche, il a quitté la Suisse pour poursuivre ses études à Philadelphia, dans le département d'histoire de l'art de l'Université de Pennsylvania. Il arrive d'ailleurs, c'est intéressant, dans cette université au même moment que les archives de Venturi et Scott Brown Associates qui ont été offertes à UPenn en 2006. C'est un hasard quand même à relever. D'ailleurs, deux œuvres de cette collection sont visibles dans l'exposition. En 2008, il revient à Zurich et rédige sa thèse de doctorat à la faculté d'architecture de l'EPFZ. Sa thèse s'intitule en anglais « Put into Perspective, Aesthetics, Form and Discourse of the City in Venturi's and Scott Brown's Learning from Las Vegas ». Il développe en parallèle, ou plutôt en complémentarité certainement, ses recherches sur la ville, sur l'image et sur l'œuvre de Venturi et Scott Brown, par l'enseignement, donc comme j'ai dit tout à l'heure, à l'Institut d'histoire et de la théorie de l'architecture à l'EPFZ, mais aussi à l'Université de Zurich et de Lucerne. Il est aussi plusieurs fois intervenu dans le cadre du PNR, le Programme national de recherche critique de l'image du Fonds national suisse de la recherche scientifique. Martino Stierli écrit régulièrement donc dans les revues d'architecture et à la NZZ, entre autres. Et il est aussi actif dans l'édition, notamment comme membre du board éditorial de EE-Files, de la EE School de Londres, et correspondant pour la Suisse à la newsletter du European Architectural History Network, basé à Delft, et membre fondateur et éditeur du journal d'architecture online Archimera. Il a publié donc bien sûr le catalogue de l'exposition Las Vegas Studio. Dans ce catalogue, outre le texte de Martino Stierli, il y a la sélection d'images et un dialogue entre le curateur Hans-Ulrich Schobrist, Peter Fischli, l'artiste, et l'architecte Rem Koolhaas, et un texte de Stanislaus von Moos. Et il a aussi publié, il y a déjà quand même une année, ce livre, Las Vegas im Rückspiel, die Stadt in Theorie, Photographie und Film. Ce livre est issu de sa thèse de doctorat. Et il a reçu pour cette thèse donc, la médaille d'or de l'EPFZ et le prix Theodor Fischer du Central Institute für Kunstgeschichte à Munich. Il y a dans la NZZ d'aujourd'hui un article sur ce livre. Probablement que l'article a été motivé aussi par l'exposition à Lausanne, j'en serais très fier. Voilà, merci beaucoup de venir nous parler ce soir et je te cède la parole.
Merci bien Cyril, c'était très gentil, un peu embarrassant, ça semble me sentir très vieux quand j'entends tout ça. Merci aussi beaucoup à l'école, ici à Archizoom, pour la générosité de être hôte de notre exposition et aussi de m'inviter ce soir pour donner cette conférence. Je vais maintenant parler anglais, c'est plus facile pour moi, j'espère que vous pouvez quand même suivre. Les gens au fond, je voudrais bien inviter de venir un peu plus proche parce qu'il y a beaucoup d'images qui sont... ça vaut vraiment la peine et je pense on les voit mieux si vous venez un peu plus proche. Okay. So thanks again for Cyril and Archizoom. My paper today has 3 sections. In the first part, I will analyze the use of new media such as photography and in particular film, which is the main subject of my talk today. So the use of new media for the analysis and representation of the city in learning from Las Vegas. In the second part, I will discuss some historical antecedents of a filmic view of the city that were, I believe, important for Venturi and Scott Brown when they undertook their own research. And then finally, to round things up, I will finish with a few theoretical remarks on the affinity of architecture and film, which has been a major topic throughout modernity. I would like to start with a quote from Denise Scott Brown. Quote, "Las Vegas is not a standard for future growth. It's a standard for conceptual analysis." Thus stated Denise Scott Brown on the occasion of a panel discussion in 2004 referring to the Learning from Las Vegas research studio that she had conducted at the Yale School of Architecture in the fall of 1968, together with her partner Robert Venturi and their teaching assistant Steven Izenour. The quote unmistakably redirects attention from problems of contemporary urbanism to methodological aspects concerning the analysis of the city. I would like to argue that such methodological issues were indeed at the core of the Learning from Las Vegas project. Both the 1968 research studio and the ensuing 1972 book publication of the same title, Learning from Las Vegas, addressed a twofold problem. The visual analysis of contemporary urban form on the one hand, and the adequate visual representation of this form on the other. What brought Venturi and Scott Brown to Las Vegas in the first place was their interest in a new automobile-oriented urban form that had evolved in the post-war years and that increasingly dominated the image of the cities of the American West. And you can see them, Robert Venturi and Denise Scott Brown, here driving in their car along the Las Vegas Strip. The Las Vegas Strip, they argued, represented the archetype of this form known as urban sprawl. For them, traditional conceptions of the city based on an idealized image of the medieval European town were no longer adequate to describe this evolving ex-urban landscape. In contrast to the prevailing opinion in the 1960s, the authors of Learning from Las Vegas saw in urban sprawl not the chaotic product of laissez-faire politics, but rather a self-regulating urban form with a hidden order, as they said, and its own spatial logic. In their search for such a hidden order, media such as photography and film served as major epistemological tools. The materials we gathered for the Las Vegas studio exhibition currently on show here at Archizoom are but a small selection of thousands of slides and many hours of film footage by Venturi, Scott Brown, Izenour, and their students from the Yale studio that they produced during their field trip to Las Vegas in October of 1968. In the following, and as I already said, I would like to focus on film in particular as a tool for the conceptual analysis of the city. Denise Scott Brown repeatedly voiced her interest in filmic techniques for the analysis and representation of urban form. In her 1971 text, Learning from Pomp, she commented, quote, "New analytic techniques must use film and videotape to convey the dynamism of sign architecture and the sequential experience of vast landscapes. In her view, film was capable of representing urban form much better than such relatively static media, such as cartography or even photography. The contemporary city presented itself to an observer as a spatio-temporal experience, and for this reason it was best understood by means of a visual narration, that is, as a sequence of images comparable to a cinematic experience. In her view, the image of the contemporary city was best characterized as a sequence of vistas of a mobile, that is, automobile observer. And that is why we find throughout their research and also in the exhibition here at Archizoom several of these sequences which try to simulate this cinematic approach to the city. It is interesting to note that Scott Brown also hinted at the potential of commercial movies to produce a strong urban image. In her 1969 essay entitled On Pop Art, Permissiveness and Planning, she wrote, quote, "Planners and urban designers should be leading the way, but it is the movie makers, for example, Antonioni in La Notte and Red Desert, and more effectively in Blow Up, who have investigated the architectural implications of the local scene," end quote. Scott Brown, at this point, could not refer to Michelangelo Antonioni's road movie Zabriskie Point yet, a film released in the following year, featuring a traveling sequence through Los Angeles by a car which is actually quite similar to those undertaken by Venturi and Scott Brown and the students in Las Vegas a couple of years earlier. According to them, architects had failed to understand the implications of a changing urban form for the profession and could learn from the other arts, from photographers and filmmakers in particular, who had started to develop adequate representational techniques for these new urban and visual phenomena. Not just the automobile-oriented urban form of Las Vegas, but the city's iconography as well had changed the imagination of movie makers, had challenged the imagination of movie makers. By the 1960s, mass media and Hollywood took a vital part in shaping and disseminating the image of Las Vegas. At a very early stage, the movie industry had portrayed Las Vegas as the playground of the mafia, to which the city allegedly owed much of its existence and financial success. And I'm showing a few of the posters of early movies, commercial productions which featured Las Vegas or which were at least situated in Las Vegas. This helped building up the myth of a city that in many ways took the part of a carnivalesque and exotic counterpart to the dominant white Anglo-Saxon Protestant Puritanism of the rest of the United States. At the same time, a heist comedy such as Ocean's 11 from 1960, and I'm of course referring to the original, not the remake with which we all know, the past few years by Steven Soderbergh. So Ocean's 11 from 1960, starring Frank Sinatra and his Rat Pack, promoted Las Vegas as the entertainment capital of the West. George Sidney's well-known 1964 production Viva Las Vegas, starring Elvis Presley, is particularly interesting with regard to Venturi and Scott Brown's Learning from Las Vegas. With this film, the city entered into American pop culture for good. The movie, Viva Las Vegas, which you probably all know, opens with a flight and drive over Fremont Street in downtown Las Vegas, as well as the Strip at night, staging the visual exuberance of the neon-lit signs. Sidney's visualization not only provided the classic image of 1960s Las Vegas, it also anticipated Venturi and Scott Brown's obsession with this remarkable urban aesthetic. And I'm going to show you this introduction now with some music. back to the question of urban form, Venturi and Scott Brown made it clear that for them, Las Vegas represented an essentially new type of city that required new means of graphic and visual representation. And a quote from Learning from Las Vegas: "This study will help to define a new type of urban form emerging in America and Europe, radically different from that we have known, one that we have been ill-equipped to deal with, and that, from ignorance, we define today as urban sprawl. An aim of this studio will be, through open-minded and non-judgmental investigation, to come to understand this new form and to begin to evolve techniques for its handling." Unlike earlier treatises on urbanism, Venturi and Scott Brown, in their analysis, particularly stressed the perceptual and phenomenological aspects of urban form. The authors of Learning from Las Vegas argued that the contemporary city was a consequence of the changed perceptual conditions brought about by the mobilized gaze of the automobile observer. The image of the city was therefore not a matter of simultaneous and instantaneous perception, but of a sequence of moving images, itself best represented in film and image sequences. These methodological concerns were at the core of the 1968 Yale Research Studio. Its preliminary program specifically asked the students to use cinematic techniques for the analysis of the city. This focus on filmic methods of representation is evident within the book as well. Most explicitly in a 2-page spread of black and white film stills that report a car drive on the strip and that you see projected here. This is, of course, the first edition of 1972. The thing looks a little different in the more well-known paperback edition, which came out later, and I suppose similar also in the French edition of the late 1970s. The temporal succession of individual images that cannot be depicted in the static medium of a book is here translated into a spatial order. The reader is set in virtual motion, similar to a cinematic experience. It is not surprising, perhaps, that out of the Learning from Las Vegas Research Studio resulted a number of films produced by the students of the Yale studio. And those who have already visited the exhibition in the other room have already seen parts of these films that were produced. Among the several assignments, Venturi and Scott Brown gave to their students at least 2 explicitly called for filmic experimentation. One of the assignments, for example, read, quote, "Our representation techniques learned from architecture and planning impede our understanding of Las Vegas, since they are static, where it is dynamic, contained, where it is open, 2-dimensional, where it is 3-dimensioned. You students are asked to take over graphics coordination task for the class, which involves expediting the production of a film script for 16mm filming by the class," end quote. So during their 9-day research trip to Los Angeles and Las Vegas, the students spent 2 full days producing these films, producing the footage for these films. The first film I would like to look at is entitled Las Vegas Deadpan and has a running time of 21 minutes. It is an uncommanded record of a drive along the Las Vegas Strip, interrupted by a number of cuts and crossfades. The scenery changes several times from day to night, where the effect of the illuminated neon signs is the most striking element. Moreover, a short sequence from a helicopter ride is interspersed, after which the car drive resumes. So this is an excerpt from Las Vegas Deadpan. Of course, also besides the theoretical and methodological implications, a very interesting historical document. If anybody's ever been to Las Vegas and visited the Strip, which of course everybody does who goes to Las Vegas, will notice that there's nothing there anymore. It looks totally different. It's an entirely built-up city nowadays with high-rises and nothing compared to this suburban environment that we see here as was to be found in 1968. The main theme of this film is the inanimate registering of the daytime cityscape of the Las Vegas Strip. The film title, Las Vegas Deadpan, indicates that this immobile impression was a deliberate representational technique. The adjective deadpan was originally composed out of the words dead and pan, a colloquial expression for the face in 19th century English usage. The adjective deadpan describes a state marked by complete absence of expression or mobility and giving no sign of emotional or personal commitment or involvement. In an article written in 1970, Denise Scott Brown clarified the meaning of deadpanning for their conceptual approach to studying urban form. Quote, "What new techniques are required to document new forms? We should aim to deadpan the material so that it speaks for itself. Rouchet has pioneered this treatment in his monographs," and she's referring to the photographer Ed Rouchet, whom I will be talking about in an instant. So Rouchet has pioneered this treatment in his monographs, Denise Scott Brown says, and goes on. "It is a way to avoid being upstaged by our own subject matter." As pointed out in her text, the deadpanning technique was borrowed from pop artist Ed Rouchet, and his typological photographic research documented in such monographs as 26 gasoline stations from 1963, some Los Angeles apartments from 1965, of which you see a double-page spread here, or 34 parking lots in Los Angeles from 1967. Venturi and Scott Brown adopted Rouchet's method of arriving at a deadpan image of the city by filming with the aid of a camera mounted on the hood of a car and equipped with an engine, a procedure Rouchet himself called continuous motorized photography. For the artist, this technique was a way to overcome artistic considerations such as selection, composition, and proportion, as well as the selective perception of the human eye. Rouchet repeatedly underlined his intent to take on the habitus of a news reporter whose primary objective is to faithfully record what presents itself to the eye. Through deadpanning, then, the facts would allegedly be reduced to their factuality, while creative interventions by the artist would be largely repressed. Returning to the Las Vegas Deadpan movie, it should be stressed, however, that this concept is in itself a highly artificial and artistic setup. The deadpanning procedure clearly produces an image unavailable to the human eye without the aid of a prosthetic apparatus. In other words, it does not simply represent reality, but it constructs its own new visual reality. Learning from Las Vegas not only repeatedly refers to procedures such as the deadpanning techniques, the study also emphasized the commitment to scientific standards. Thus, the specific use of the camera as a reporting tool seems to be directly related to the concept of mechanical objectivity in 19th century positivist science. As the theoreticians of science Lorraine Daston and Peter Gallison have shown, these scientists from the 19th century trusted in photographic devices as a means to overcome subjective value judgments and to arrive at a more precise representation of reality and truthfulness to nature than would be possible by conventional scientific techniques such as drawings. To positivist science, photography seemed to offer an entirely transparent medium that represents its subject matter faithfully and uninfluenced by the researcher's cognitive interest and prejudice. At first sight, the deadpanning procedure and the use of a camera, which, as employed by Venturi and Scott Brown, their students, seem to imply an attempt at objectively documenting the outside world in a similar way. However, instead of a documentary or even objective view of the world, deadpanning should rather be understood as a rhetoric of objectivity. Scott Brown recently commented on this problem, quote, "It was a subjectivity garbed as objectivity, a wolf in sheep's clothing. We were quite aware of it." In other words, deadpanning, go back again to the image, deadpanning must not be confounded with naivete towards the issue at stake, which in this case is the commercial American suburban city, but on the contrary, as an attempt of cultivating and in fact performing naivete. It has to do, in other words, with taking on a certain attitudes towards the subject matter in order to arrive at an image of the city thus far unavailable to the human eye. Contrasting the Deadpan movie, a second film produced by the students of the Learning from Las Vegas Research Studio is entitled Las Vegas Electric. This time, the subject is the spectacular nightscape, mainly around the downtown Fremont Street, and the transformation of architectural form into ephemeral appearances of color and light, for which the architectural hardware seems nothing more than the necessary infrastructure. A theme that seemingly echoes Rainer Banham's contemporary writings on the transformation of architecture into unarchitectonic and amorphous environments. And it's perhaps no coincidence that Rainer Banham was interested in and wrote about Las Vegas at the very same moment that Venturi and Scott Brown also became interested in this subject. I'm showing a page from his essay from 1967, Towards a Million Volt Light and Sound Culture, with a black and white shot of downtown, of Fremont Street in downtown Las Vegas. Unlike the Deadpan movie discussed before, this film, Las Vegas Electric, is characterized by an emphatically artistic and expressionist approach. It suggests that Paul Scheerbart's expressionist dream of indescribable nights of light from the early 20th century may finally become a reality in the 1960s Las Vegas nightscape. I'm skipping a little bit of the beginning. there's a quasi-surreal sequence, which you see right here, where the neon signs along the road are mirrored horizontally. In another passage, which we just saw, in the middle of the film, the bright neon lights on the soffit above the sidewalk on Fremont Street are transformed into an almost psychedelic abstraction of colors, forms, and lights. In contrast to the automobile view of the first film, this movie also includes a pedestrian perspective. And several of the takes clearly recall the introductory sequence of Learning from Las Vegas, which we watched earlier. And finally, a third movie documents a helicopter ride over the strip during daytime. I also have a brief section. The focus of the camera is predominantly on the large high reader signs along the roads, such as the Stardust, which we see here, which attract the attention of the driver from a large distance. The main theme of the film is the displacement of architectural form by the symbolic dimension of architecture, so signs rather than architecture. At the same time, it is the only film from the Yale studio that does not focus on the view from the road. In so doing, it adapts a relatively conventional perspective for the depiction of the city, as the bird's eye view had already been experimented back in the 1920s. For example, in a German production of a series of short films on the modern housing that showed the horseshoe-shaped colony Berlin-Britz by Bruno Taut and Martin Wagner. So this is a 1920s German production with this bird's eye view. Again, the artist Ed Russet served as a direct source for Venturi and Scott Brown, who also used the bird's eye view for his artist's book 13 Parking Lots in Los Angeles from 1967. This brings me to the second part of my lecture. By focusing their attention on the image of the city and the question how urban space is perceived by an automobile spectator, Venturi and Scott Brown opted for a phenomenological approach to urbanism. Using the terminology of the French theoretician Henri Lefebvre, their approach was a shift away from conceived space, espace conçu, to perceived space, espace perçu. This methodological shift had clear antecedents in post-war architectural discourse. I'm going to talk about some of the sources now. Among them was the English Townscape movement, which was propagated in the British magazine journal Architectural Review between the late 1940s and into the mid-1960s. The Townscape movement had its roots in Gestalt theory and was preoccupied primarily with, quote, the visual aspects of architecture as distinguished from the technical, professional, sociological aspects, end quote. Gordon Cullen, the spokesman of the Townscape movement and later author of the book of the same title, of which you see a page here, Gordon Cullen held that the city did not present itself as a static image, but as a dynamic experience of a viewer in motion. Thus, in the introduction to his book, Cullen stated that, quote, although the pedestrian walks through the town at a uniform speed, the scenery of towns is often revealed in a series of jerks and revelations. Consequently, he argued for serial vision, as he called it, as a basic precondition for the perception of the city and called for, quote, designing our towns from the point of view of the moving person, end quote. He thereby anticipated the central aspect of learning from Las Vegas, although, of course, without taking into consideration the automobile observer. The sequentiality of film of city perception is illustrated in various instances within Cullen's publication, most notably in his elaborate drawings of town studies, such as the one here for a town called Evesham, or also in the medium of photography, such as in this sequence, this promenade urbaine, as we could call it, through another town called Blandford Forum. Despite Venturi's and Scott Brown's reservations that townscape ideology was purely what they called picturesque, Scott Brown acknowledged the Architectural Review's article series on Townscape as an important input for their own architectural and urbanistic thinking. Moreover, Venturi's very first publication, a critical assessment of the urban renewal around the Campidoglio in Rome from a historical perspective, was published by the Architectural Review as a contribution to the Townscape series. So here you see this label Townscape, and then what follows is the very first essay ever published by Robert Venturi. The content of this article and argument were clearly informed by the Townscape approach to the city. The Townscape movement was probably the single most important instance of a phenomenological approach to post-war urbanism, and it was a major inspiration not only for Learning from Las Vegas, but for other American research in this field as well. One of them that should be singled out is a research project conducted at MIT, at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, in the late 1950s that was entitled The Perceptual Form of the City. Again, this focus on questions of perception of urban form. This program was co-directed by Georgi Kepes and Kevin Lynch. Just like the Townscape movement, the Perceptual Form of the City research program must be considered an important point of reference for Venturi and Scott Brown. Kevin Lynch's famous study, The Image of the Book, The Image of the City, was published in 1960, is the most widely known result from this research. The relationship between automobile movement and the form of the city was a central focus of the entire research project, and is certainly at the center also of Kevin Lynch's study. In his essay, Notes on Expression and Communication in the Cityscape from 1961, the other main author of this project, Georgi Kepes, the Hungarian artist and researcher, referred to the cinematic term of the sequence of vistas, which he characterized as, quote, the basic unit of our urban vision. So, cinematic, the sequence of vistas is the basic unit of our urban vision, says Kepes. Likewise, he stressed the potential offered by cinematography for the analysis of the form of the city. Kevin Lynch, again, the other key figure in the MIT program, argued in similar terms. His book, The View from the Road, published in 1964 in collaboration with Donald Appleyard, who actually studied together with Denise Scott Brown at the AA back in the 50s. So with Donald Appleyard and John Mayer, is particularly relevant with regard to Learning from Las Vegas. This study, The View from the Road, focused on the mobilized gaze of the automobile observer of the post-war city. Its goal was to develop a design strategy for urban highways that would allow the driver to experience the city as a well-ordered, aesthetically pleasing, and meaningful whole. As Venturi and Scott Brown, the perception of the city was conceived as a sequential experience of a moving spectator. And again, also in this book, we can find these photographic sequences here, even with such a feature, which which tells the reader how to understand this sequence. Something that was later adopted in Learning from Las Vegas. I would like to quote just one sentence from this book. The experience of a city is basically a moving view, and this is the view we must understand if we wish to reform the look of our cities. The idea of such an affinity between architecture and film is implicitly present both in The View from the Road and Learning from Las Vegas, and their argument is actually quite similar in this respect. The potentially distracted filmic gaze of the car driver confronts the road engineer or the urban designer with the task of directing and forming his perception of the city. Quote from The View from the Road. The cinema, so there's a very direct reference to the cinema. The cinema tells its story with dramatic changes in the separation between camera and actor, from close-up to long shot, depending on what is being said. So it is on the city highway. The designer can decide what he wants to emphasize: a total skyline, a distinct character, a single landmark, and adjust his viewing distance accordingly. As in the cinema, contrasting distances will keep his sequences legible and eventful. End quote. Thus, engineer and architect become directors of the gaze. The scopic regime of the post-war city is that of the automobile observer, driving at heightened speed. And if urban sprawl is to be understood, this vision in motion has to be taken into account, is the joint lesson by Learning from Las Vegas and The View from the Road. Which brings me to the third and final short part of my lecture, which I would like to conclude with a few theoretical thoughts on the affinity of architecture and film. Historically speaking, the avant-garde had early discovered the potential of film for the representation of the city. Already in 1896, a cameraman of the Lumiere brothers mounted his camera on a gondola while moving through the canals of Venice in order to film the palazzi on the banks. And I'm going to try to show you this. Document. Oops, I'm sorry.
This is the first tracking shot. This is the first tracking shot. In Venice, a photograph in Venice by an operator called Alexandre Romeo, and he was so afraid that Lumiere was going to yell at him that he apologized in his letter. On the opposite, Lumiere was so impressed by the film that he asked all the operators, which he sent throughout the world, to do that kind of shot, which he was calling not a tracking shot, not a traveling, but a panorama. He asked the camera always to be on a moving either carriage or...
So that was already it. 1896. I hope Sorry. Okay. One of the earliest manifestations of a preoccupation with the use of film in architecture and urbanism is a short essay by somebody called H.W. Joost that was published in the German journal Der Städtebau, Town Planning, in 1916. According to this author, a certain Herr Joost, film was superior to, quote, lifeless photography for the representation of urban experience. Particularly in the German Werkbund, film received a great deal of attention as well, as is evidenced not only in the Cologne Werkbund exhibition of 1914, but also in the 1929 exhibition Film und Foto that propagated the new scene, a new vision. Indeed, the affinity of architecture and film, or architecture and the city and film, has been a stereotypical notion of modernity. Film scholar Juliana Bruno reflected in this respect, quote, film is a product of modernity, the era of the metropolis, and has expressed an urban viewpoint from its very origin. On the eve of the invention of the cinema, a network of architectural forms produced a new spatial visuality. Sites of transit, such as arcades, bridges, department stores, the pavilions of exhibition halls, incarnated the new geography of modernity. Mobility, a form of cinematics, was the essence of these new architectures. By changing the relation between spatial perception and bodily motion, the architect of transit prepared the ground for the invention of the moving image. If these deliberations by Giuliano Bruno are correct, then a spatial dispositif of the transitory would have been instantiated in the modern metropolis through its characteristic spatial typologies described by people like Charles Baudelaire, Walter Benjamin, and others. A spatial configuration that in turn prepared the field for the perceptual dispositif of the moving image. In his seminal text, Paris, Capital of the 19th Century, Walter Benjamin characterized the figure of the flaneur as a representative of a proto-cinematic gaze. The imaginary flânerie of the cinematic spectator, it could be said, is a more or less direct descendant of the mobilized gaze of the flaneur. It was this regime of mobilized vision that Venturi and Scott Brown were interested in, although applied to the form of the post-war city and urban sprawl, and not the 19th century metropolis. As they argued, the major new factor in this urban form was the automobile. According to their concept, the automobile was an apparatus that enhances vision and that is capable of rendering visible the hidden order of contemporary urban form. Despite obvious media differences, film and architecture share similar practices of perception and reception. Again, quote from Giuliano Bruno, "An architectural ensemble is read as it is traversed. This is also the case for the cinematic spectacle, for film is read as it is traversed and is readable insofar as it is traversable." In both the cinema and post-war American urban sprawl, a technical apparatus is constitutive for perception. Unlike the imaginary flânerie of the cinematic spectator, the body of the automobile observer is not immobilized, but is being moved by a machine, the car, in order to produce an illusion of a sequence of moving images. And unlike the flaneur of the 19th century, the mobilized gaze of the car driver is based on a technical dispositif. The car is a machine for a new perception of the city, of a vision in motion. Instead of the camera, it serves as a prosthesis for the human eye, with whose help can be made visible the hidden order of the contemporary city. It brings to the fore what Benjamin called the optical unconscious. It should be said that a number of avant-garde architects and theoreticians of the early 20th century, besides Benjamin, deliberated on the relationship between architecture and film, in particular the Soviet filmmaker Sergei Eisenstein, or also Laszlo Mori-Nagy. Eisenstein, himself a trained architect, developed his theories in a text posthumously published as Montage and Architecture, in which he wrote, quote Eisenstein, "The film camera's undoubted ancestor is architecture. The key category for this assertion is sequence, which is fundamental not only for Eisenstein's theory of filmic montage, but also an essential prerequisite in the perception of architecture and the city." Eisenstein supported his thesis by referring himself to Auguste Choisy's Histoire de l'Architecture from 1899, which you can see here below. And this is Choisy's original. Using the Acropolis in Athens as an example, Choisy developed a theory of a picturesque ancient urbanism. The ancient Greek polis was, according to him, and using Eisenstein's terminology, structured by the montage of individual visual impressions into a succession of images and a spectator in motion. Consequently, the Acropolis would have been designed so as to represent a sequence of images to an approaching spectator whose movement is guided by a complex administration of the gaze. And of course, I don't have to point out explicitly that Le Corbusier also referred himself directly to Auguste Choisy's theory of picturesque urbanism, which was then also taken up by Eisenstein for his idea of a cinematic understanding of architecture and the city. The translation of the ancient concept of the procession to the sanctuary in the Greek polis into modern theories of urbanism is latently present in Learning from Las Vegas. Venturi and Scott Brown and their students hinted at a tradition of peripatetic vision in the ancient city by including in their study a schematic map that interprets the Las Vegas Strip as ceremonial space, as they called it, and thus refers to representational techniques borrowed from Giambattista Nolli for Baroque Rome. Scott Brown has recently commented on this, quote, "If Nolli marked the pilgrim's way through Rome, then ours showed the tourist's way along the Strip, a processional punctuated by casinos. Very much like in a processional way, the hotels and casinos along the Strip are strung to a para-religious station way, one could say. In capitalist consumer culture, the sanctuaries of the ancient processions are replaced by casinos promising redemption through material wealth. Seen in this way, the spatial order of the Strip is an architectural instantiation of a ritual of consumer culture. It has inscribed itself into the urban topography, which is organized according to the mobilized gaze of the automobile observer." Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup. Est-ce que quelqu'un a une question? Je viens avec le micro pour que la question soit
So it's a question concerning the first part of your presentation.
Yes.
And you were talking about the deadpan view.
Yeah.
And I was asking myself whether you see a parallel between Venturi's and Scott Brown's fascination for this deadpan view and their promotion, between brackets, of the decorated shed being itself also quite a horizontal way of conceiving architecture in the end.
In a way, yes. I've never thought about that, but it's an interesting point. What you're saying basically is a decorated shed is a very graphic understanding of architecture, a very two-dimensional understanding. Of course, what this very artificial technical setup produces is a very, I mean, it's in a way a very flat representation of an endless urban space. I mean, it's an interesting observation. I've never thought about it. But yes, perhaps there is a connection to that. Yeah. It's an interesting point. Thanks for pointing that out. Did you have any afterthought, or what made you think?
It just came to my mind listening to you, because I mean, I've read of their fascination and also for Ed Rouchet, but I somehow never built or put it in relation to the decorated shed. But all of a sudden, looking at all the movies, I thought, but that's somehow, I mean, that's such a flat view of observing urban space that maybe this way of flattening the image is it's at the basis of the two of their passions.
I mean, that makes perfect sense to me. Also, obviously, because all the signs that would be visible in this deadpan view are, of course, absolutely orthogonal to the viewing perspective. Yeah. It's an interesting observation. Because this is, of course, one of the main problems, or has been one of the main problems. Many people have asked me always, what is the point? What is? Okay, it's interesting that they did this research, but what were the effects on architecture? and actually on their design and on their project. And of course, for a while, I would argue there are very strong connections where they actually try to almost take this example of Las Vegas one-to-one. Of course, they make something very, very different out of it, but it's a very clear reference. But in later, very soon after that, I think the influence becomes less visible, and it's not such an easy connection to be made between their research and their design work.
Thank you. Another comment or question? Yeah.
So a very simple question, a curiosity. And please allow me to ask you in French. J'aimerais savoir s'il y a eu beaucoup de travail de reformatage des images pour le livre. Je m'explique. En vous écoutant aujourd'hui et en regardant les images, moi je suis très frappée par la force du cadrage obligé par la technique de la photo, par l'appareil technique photographique et l'appareil technique du film, de la caméra. Et qui est très fort par rapport à la production des images à laquelle nous sommes aujourd'hui habitués, les digitales, qui n'a pas du tout cette force de cadrage. Là, c'est vraiment très, très étonnant. Et alors, j'aimerais savoir si dans les livres, il y a eu après cette liberté avec l'image que nous avons aujourd'hui, ou si par contre, c'était exhiber cette force, cette neutralité, entre guillemets, mais une neutralité qui finalement elle est contraignante, du format de l'image.
May I ask, are you talking about the book Learning from Las Vegas? Is it
Yes, the original edition, of course.
Because I actually didn't show, this is I think almost, one of the few images that I showed from this original, this is of course film stills by the film, not in the book. And there's another thing I showed which is kind of a, maybe this is helpful if I show you this one image here. Can you make it so I really understand what your question refers to?
Alors, je vois les images qui reprennent, je crois, les formats ou de la diapositive du film, celle qu'on voit en bas à droite.
Ouais.
D'autres images, les rectangles debout, disons. Est-ce que c'est un format qui revient constamment? Il me semble que c'est la proportion exactement la même que les autres images noir et blanc qui sont en format portrait. Est-ce que c'est... je vous demande au contenu du fait que vous avez vu les sources documentaires à partir desquelles on a fait les livres. Il y a beaucoup de recadrage ou pas? C'est ça la question. Est-ce qu'il y a
je dirais pas vraiment. Dans ce livre, peut-être un peu plus, parce qu'il y avait aussi there was this great misunderstanding somehow between the graphic designer, Muriel Cooper from MIT Press, and the authors, especially Denise Scott Brown. She was not at all happy with the way images were handled in this book. She thought that their conception, their theoretical framework, was actually totally distorted by the way the city was represented in this book. I would argue that's not really true. I think actually the graphic designer did a very good job at trying to simulate this mobile view and this multi-perspectivity. What I would agree very much with Denise Scott Brown is that the first edition, which is here, is almost unreadable. It's really more a picture book, and the theoretical part becomes a graphic add-on, which is obviously a problem if you want to say, and of course the text is a very important part of the book also, and that was actually then reversed and in the paperback edition. As for your question, really concerning how if the images were cut and so on, for the most part I would say no. They were left in the original small scale format as they had been taken. And of course, in the book, there's also, besides their photographs, I also have to say, many other sources. They also included postcards or advertisement material on Las Vegas and so on.
But there is this beautiful example. It's not in the book, I think, but in the exhibition of this collage of photographies for showing the street and coming from Ed Rochelle.
Yeah. Well, obviously, there's that's true.
They took a lot of liberty with this.
Yeah, and it's a collage, and it's a view of the city. Did I show it? I think I didn't show it tonight. Which tries to represent every building along the strip, and not every building, just everything. And this is, of course, a view that you cannot represent in one single photograph. So it's a continuous elevation of a whole view. And there, of course, it's a very strong
manipulation.
Manipulation, absolutely. And it's a production of a highly artificial image of the city, which I was also trying to argue with the deadpan. The cadrage is really the medium is the message. It's the whole point. It's something that would not be visible without this apparatus and with this manipulative impetus.
These technical questions. Are the white and black pictures color pictures that are white and they're turned into black and white?
Which is an interesting point.
This I knew. Because normally I think they went with an Alpa camera for white and black, which was a square format, right? Was the Alpa not a square format? A 6.6 or an 8.8?
Yeah.
So
and they didn't use that kind of camera. They used just a very commercial...
They used the common one here,
right,
and then turned some pictures from color to black and white.
Exactly, yeah. Which is an interesting point. Obviously, they were trying, and also, as you know, in the paperback edition, almost everything is black and white. There's a 2-page spread which is color, of course, also for cost sakes. But the impression given is really quite different. It's in a way less staring. I learned today from Olivier Lucan that taking color photographs and actually reproducing them back in the 60s was a total no-go. The first time ever artists used, successfully used color photographs was only in 1976 in a joint show by who again? It was in the Whitney Museum of American Art, and that was apparently for the first time that some serious photographer actually tried to show. So this kitsch view of the city was also, of course, supported by the use of color, and it was probably also a deliberate polemic, which perhaps was taken a little back in the second edition, and therefore used black and white.
Thank you. If there is no more question, I invite you to have a drink. And thank you very much for the exhibition and this very interesting lecture. Thank you.
Thanks very much.